The blood on the letter had dried to a rusty brown by the time Greta Zimmer clutched it in her trembling hands, standing on the dusty platform of Fort Stanton, New Mexico Territory, in the scorching July heat of 1878. She had traveled 3 weeks by train and stage-coach from Pennsylvania, leaving behind everything she knew, everyone who had ever looked at her with pity or disgust. The letter promised a new start as a schoolteacher in this frontier town, a place where nobody knew her story, where the high collars of her dresses would hide the puckered scar that twisted from her jaw down her neck like a gnarled tree root. The fire that had taken her parents 5 years ago had also taken the smooth skin she once had, replacing it with a mark that made children cry and grown men turn away. Fort Stanton sprawled before her, a collection of adobe buildings and wooden structures baking under the relentless sun. Soldiers from the nearby military post moved through the streets alongside ranchers, miners, and families trying to carve out lives in this harsh territory. The air smelled of dust, horses, and the faint scent of pinyon pine from the distant mountains. "Miss Zimmer." A woman's voice cut through Greta's thoughts. She turned to find a plump woman in her 50s, her face weathered but kind, approaching with a warm smile. "I'm Martha Sullivan. The town council asked me to meet you and get you settled." "Thank you for coming," Greta said softly, adjusting her collar higher on her neck despite the heat. The gesture was automatic now, born from 5 years of hiding. Martha's eyes were sharp but not unkind. "You must be exhausted. Let's get you to the boarding house first, then I'll show you the schoolhouse. Classes don't start for another week, so you'll have time to prepare." As they walked through the town, Greta noticed the curious stares. New faces were always interesting in small towns, and a single woman arriving alone was bound to spark gossip. She kept her head down, her hand occasionally reaching up to ensure her collar remained in place. The boarding house was a 2-story structure at the edge of town, run by a widow named Mrs. Crawford. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the main street. Greta unpacked her few belongings while Martha waited downstairs, her movements methodical and practiced. Everything she owned fit into 2 carpet bags. When she came back down, Martha was talking with Mrs. Crawford in hushed tones. They stopped when Greta appeared, and she knew they had been discussing her. "People always discussed her. Ready to see where you'll be working?" Martha asked brightly, as if the conversation had never happened. The schoolhouse stood at the north end of town, a simple rectangular building with 6 windows and a bell tower. Inside, wooden benches faced a small desk and blackboard. Books lined shelves along one wall, more than Greta had expected in such a remote place. "We take education seriously here," Martha explained. "Most of the ranchers want their children to have opportunities they never had. You'll have about 20 students, ages 6 to 16. Some come from the fort, some from the surrounding ranches." Greta ran her fingers along the desk, imagining herself standing here, teaching children their letters and numbers. This was what she had trained for, what she was good at. Maybe here, her knowledge would matter more than her appearance. "Thank you, Mrs. Sullivan. I'll do my best to serve the community well." Martha patted her arm. "I'm sure you will, dear. Now, there's a town social tomorrow evening at the church. It would be a good opportunity for you to meet everyone." Greta's stomach tightened. Social gatherings were torture, full of stares and whispered comments. But she needed to make a good impression, to show the townspeople she was capable and respectable. "I'll be there," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. That evening, alone in her room, Greta stood before the small mirror and slowly unbuttoned her collar. The scar glared back at her, angry and permanent. It started just below her left ear, jagged and thick, running down her neck to disappear beneath her chemise. She had learned to avoid mirrors, but tonight she forced herself to look. "This is who you are now," she whispered, "and you're going to make the best of it." The next day passed slowly as Greta explored the town, trying to memorize the layout and gather supplies for her classroom. She bought chalk and slate at the general store, where the proprietor's wife eyed her high collar with obvious curiosity, but said nothing. She visited the small library attached to the church and met Reverend Thompson, a gentle man in his 60s who welcomed her warmly. By evening, her nerves were frayed. She dressed carefully in her best dress, a modest gray wool with lace at the collar that covered her completely despite the heat. She pinned her dark blonde hair into a neat bun and took a deep breath before heading to the church. The social was already in full swing when she arrived. Lanterns hung from the rafters, and tables laden with food lined one wall. Families clustered in groups, children chasing each other between the adults. A fiddle player in the corner provided music, and several couples danced in the center of the room. Greta stood in the doorway, suddenly overwhelmed by the noise and the crowd. She was about to turn and flee when Martha appeared at her elbow. "There you are. Come, let me introduce you around." The next hour was a blur of names and faces. Greta met ranchers and their wives, shopkeepers, a doctor, the blacksmith, and several soldiers from the fort. Everyone was polite, though she caught the familiar flickers of curiosity when they noticed how high her collar sat and how she angled her face away from direct light. She was standing near the refreshment table, grateful for a moment alone, when a commotion at the door drew everyone's attention. 3 men entered, and the crowd seemed to part naturally for them. They were clearly ranch hands, dusty from travel, but the man in the center commanded attention. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and a lean, muscular build. His dark hair was slightly too long, curling at his collar, and several days of stubble shadowed his jaw. But it was his eyes that caught Greta's attention, even from across the room. They were a startling blue-gray, bright against his tanned skin, and they held an intensity that made her catch her breath. "That's Jackson Ellis," Martha said quietly, appearing beside Greta again. "He runs the 3 Pines Ranch about 10 miles north of here. Good man, though he keeps to himself mostly. Lost his father 2 years ago and has been running the ranch alone since. Those are his ranch hands, Tom and Pete." Greta watched as Jackson greeted various townspeople. His movements were economical and graceful, despite his size. He smiled at something the blacksmith said, and the expression transformed his serious face into something almost boyish. Then his eyes swept the room and landed directly on her. Greta's breath caught. She turned away quickly, her hand automatically going to her collar. When she dared glance back, he was walking toward her, weaving through the crowd with purpose. "Miss Zimmer." His voice was deep and warm like honey. "I'm Jackson Ellis. I wanted to introduce myself. My 2 youngest siblings will be in your class, Emma and Daniel." Up close, he was even more striking. His eyes were the color of a storm, and there was something gentle in his expression despite his rugged appearance. "Mr. Ellis," she managed, extending her hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you." His hand engulfed hers, rough with calluses but surprisingly gentle. He held it a moment longer than necessary, his eyes searching her face with an openness that made her uncomfortable. She was used to people either staring at her scar or carefully avoiding looking at it. Jackson just looked at her, as if he was trying to see beneath the surface. "I hope Emma and Daniel won't give you too much trouble," he said, releasing her hand. "They're good kids, but they've been running a bit wild since our mother passed 3 years ago." "I'm sure we'll get along fine," Greta said, tucking her hand against her side. "How old are they?" Emma's 12 and Daniel's 10. I've got an older sister too, Sarah, but she's 17 now and helps run the house. Before Greta could respond, the music changed to a lively reel, and Martha called out that it was time for dancing. Jackson's ranch hands immediately claimed partners and couples flooded the floor. "Would you dance, Miss Zimmer?" Jackson asked, his eyes never leaving her face. Panic flared in Greta's chest. Dancing meant being close to someone, being seen, having people watch her. "I'm rather tired from traveling, Mr. Ellis. Perhaps another time." Something flickered in his eyes, disappointment perhaps, but he nodded graciously. "Of course. I hope you'll enjoy Fort Stanton, Miss Zimmer. It's a good town, good people." He tipped his hat and moved away, and Greta felt oddly bereft. She watched him cross the room and speak with the doctor, then help himself to a cup of punch. He didn't ask anyone else to dance. The rest of the evening passed without incident. Greta spoke with several mothers about their children and what they hoped their students would learn. She met the parents of each of her future pupils and began to form a picture of what her classroom would be like. When she finally returned to her room late that night, exhausted and overwhelmed, she found her thoughts returning to Jackson Ellis and his storm-colored eyes. She shook her head, dismissing the notion. Men like that didn't look twice at women like her, not once they saw what she was hiding. The week before school started flew by in a whirlwind of preparation. Greta organized the classroom, prepared lesson plans, and studied the books available to her. She ate her meals at the boarding house, took walks in the early morning before the heat became unbearable, and slowly began to feel like Fort Stanton might actually become home. She saw Jackson twice more during that week. Once at the general store, where he was buying supplies for his ranch. He had tipped his hat and smiled at her, his eyes warm, but he was in a hurry and didn't stop to talk. The second time was at the church on Sunday. She sat in the back, as usual, while he sat near the front with 3 younger people who must have been his siblings. During the service, she caught him glancing back at her several times, his expression thoughtful. After the service, he approached her on the church steps. "Miss Zimmer, I'd like you to meet my family. Sarah, Emma, Daniel, come here." 3 young people approached. Sarah was a pretty girl with her brother's blue-gray eyes and dark hair pulled back in a practical braid. Emma was all elbows and knees, at that awkward age between child and woman, with auburn hair and freckles. Daniel was a miniature version of Jackson, already showing signs of his brother's height. "This is Miss Zimmer, your new teacher," Jackson said to Emma and Daniel. "I expect you both to be on your best behavior and work hard." "Yes, Jackson," they chorused, though Emma rolled her eyes slightly. "Don't worry, Mr. Ellis," Greta said, smiling at the children. "I'm looking forward to having them in class." Emma studied her with open curiosity. "Why do you wear your collar so high? Aren't you hot?" "Emma," Sarah gasped, her face reddening. "That's rude." Greta's hand went automatically to her neck, and she felt her face flame. "I just prefer this style," she said quietly. But Jackson was watching her with those perceptive eyes, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that he saw more than she wanted him to. "Come on, you two," Sarah said, herding her younger siblings toward a wagon. "We need to get home and start dinner." Jackson lingered. "I apologize for Emma. She doesn't always think before she speaks." "It's all right. Children are naturally curious." "Adults can be too," he said softly. "But some of us know when questions are intrusive." Greta met his eyes, surprised by the kindness she found there. "Thank you, Mr. Ellis." "Jackson, please. Mr. Ellis was my father." He smiled, and again she was struck by how it transformed his face. "I hope you'll be happy here, Greta." "May I call you Greta?" The sound of her name in his deep voice sent an unexpected warmth through her. "Yes, of course." "Well then, Greta, I'll see you tomorrow when school starts. Emma and Daniel will be there early. Sarah makes sure of it." He touched the brim of his hat and strode away, his long legs covering the ground quickly. Greta watched him go, her heart beating faster than it should. The first day of school arrived with clear skies and moderate heat. Greta was at the schoolhouse before dawn, making sure everything was perfect. She wrote the day's lessons on the blackboard, arranged books on each desk, and tried to calm her racing nerves. The students began arriving just after 8. They came on foot, on horseback, and in wagons. Emma and Daniel arrived with Sarah, who gave Greta an encouraging smile before leaving. By 8:30, all 20 students were seated, ranging from 6-year-old twins who could barely reach the floor from their bench to a gangly 16-year-old boy named Matthew who clearly didn't want to be there. "Good morning," Greta said, standing before them. "My name is Miss Zimmer, and I'm very happy to be your teacher this year. I know we're all getting used to each other, so let's start by introducing ourselves." The day went better than she had hoped. The younger children were eager and attentive, the middle ones restless but manageable, and even Matthew seemed to warm up once she started teaching geography and showed him maps of places he'd never seen. Emma proved to be bright and curious, asking questions about everything. Daniel was quieter but diligent, working through his arithmetic problems with fierce concentration. Both children were well-mannered, and Greta could see Sarah's influence in how they conducted themselves. When the school day ended at 3, the students poured out into the sunshine, their voices echoing off the surrounding buildings. Greta tidied the classroom and was erasing the blackboard when she heard footsteps behind her. How did they do? She turned to find Jackson leaning against the doorframe, his hat in his hands. He must have come straight from work. Dust covered his clothes and a smudge of dirt marked his cheek. "They were wonderful," Greta said honestly. "Both Emma and Daniel are excellent students. Emma has a real gift for reading comprehension, and Daniel's arithmetic skills are advanced for his age." Jackson's face lit with pride. "That's good to hear. I've tried to keep up their education, but running the ranch doesn't leave much time for teaching." "You've done a fine job," Greta assured him. "They're respectful and eager to learn. That speaks to how they've been raised." He stepped into the classroom, moving closer. "I can't take all the credit. Sarah's been more mother than sister to them. She gave up a lot when our mother died." "She seems like a remarkable young woman." "She is." Jackson turned his hat in his hands, suddenly looking uncertain. "Miss Zimmer, Greta, I was wondering if you might join us for dinner this Sunday, after church. Sarah's been asking, and the kids would like to get to know their teacher better." Greta's first instinct was to refuse. Social situations outside of school were dangerous. People noticed things, asked questions, got too close. But Jackson was looking at her with such hopeful earnestness that she found herself nodding. "I'd be happy to, thank you." His smile was brilliant. "Wonderful. We'll bring you home after the service." After he left, Greta sat at her desk, wondering what she had just agreed to. But beneath the nervousness was something else, something she hadn't felt in a long time: anticipation. The days fell into a comfortable rhythm. Greta taught her students, prepared lessons in the evenings, and slowly began to make friends with some of the townswomen. Martha checked on her regularly, and Mrs. Crawford at the boarding house proved to be a font of local knowledge and surprisingly kind beneath her gruff exterior. Sunday came too quickly and too slowly at the same time. Greta dressed carefully in her best green dress with its high lace collar and tried to calm her racing heart. In church, she was acutely aware of Jackson sitting several rows ahead, his broad shoulders unmistakable even from behind. After the service, Sarah approached her with a warm smile. "We're so glad you're coming, Miss Zimmer. It's nice to have another woman around. I get outnumbered by my brothers." The ride to the Three Pines Ranch took about 30 minutes in the wagon. The landscape opened up as they left town, revealing rolling hills dotted with juniper and pine trees. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still holding snow despite the summer heat. The ranch itself was more substantial than Greta had expected. A large main house sat surrounded by several outbuildings, a barn, a bunkhouse, a smokehouse, and various sheds. Cattle grazed in distant pastures and horses moved in a nearby corral. "It's beautiful," Greta said as Jackson helped her down from the wagon. His hands were warm on her waist, and he held her a moment longer than necessary, his eyes searching her face. "Thank you. My father built most of it. I've just tried to keep it going." Inside, the house was spacious and surprisingly well kept. Sarah clearly ran a tight household. The main room served as both living space and dining area, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall. Handmade furniture filled the space, worn but comfortable. Photographs lined the mantel, showing a family in happier times. Dinner was a lively affair. Sarah had prepared a feast of roasted chicken, potatoes, fresh bread, and vegetables from her garden. Emma chattered nonstop about her favorite books, while Daniel shyly showed Greta a carving he'd been working on. Jackson sat at the head of the table, quieter than his siblings but watching Greta with an intensity that made her skin warm. After dinner, Sarah shooed everyone out of the kitchen so she could clean up. Emma dragged Greta outside to see the new puppies in the barn, and Daniel tagged along. The puppies were adorable, tumbling over each other in a pile of soft fur and wagging tails. "Can we keep them all?" Emma asked Jackson, who had followed them out. "We're keeping 2 for herding. The rest will be sold or given to families who need good-working dogs." Emma pouted but didn't argue. She'd clearly heard this before. Greta picked up one of the puppies, laughing as it licked her face enthusiastically. For a moment, she forgot to be self-conscious, forgot about her scar and her carefully maintained distance. She was just a woman playing with puppies in a barn, and it felt wonderful. When she looked up, Jackson was watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. There was warmth in his eyes and something deeper, something that looked almost like longing. "You should laugh more," he said softly. "It suits you." Greta set down the puppy, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. Emma and Daniel had wandered to the other side of the barn to look at the horses, giving them a semblance of privacy. "I don't have much reason to laugh," she said without thinking, then immediately regretted the words. They revealed too much. Jackson took a step closer. "Everyone deserves reasons to laugh, Greta. Maybe Fort Stanton will give you some." She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that she could find happiness here. But the scar hidden beneath her collar was a constant reminder that she was damaged, incomplete. As if sensing her thoughts, Jackson reached out and gently touched her shoulder. "Whatever brought you here, whatever you're running from, I hope you'll find peace here. You seem like someone who deserves it." Before she could respond, Emma called out that it was time for dessert, and the moment broke. But as they walked back to the house, Jackson's hand briefly touched the small of her back, a gesture of comfort and protection that made Greta's heart ache with wanting. The rest of the afternoon passed in a pleasant blur. Sarah served apple pie, and they all sat on the porch watching the sun paint the mountains gold and orange. Jackson told stories about the ranch and his father, his voice warm with memory and love. Emma and Daniel added their own embellishments, making everyone laugh. When it was time to take Greta back to town, Jackson insisted on driving her himself. Sarah, Emma, and Daniel waved from the porch as they pulled away. The ride was quiet at first, both of them content to watch the landscape pass. But as they drew closer to town, Jackson spoke. "I hope you'll come back to the ranch. The kids really took to you, and Sarah's been lonely for female company her own age." "I had a wonderful time," Greta said honestly. "Your family is lovely, Jackson." He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the boarding house but made no move to help her down. Instead, he turned to face her, his expression serious in the fading light. "Greta, I'm going to be honest with you. I find myself drawn to you in a way I haven't felt since before my mother died. You're intelligent and kind, and there's something about you that makes me want to know everything. But I sense you're holding back, keeping walls up. I respect that. Everyone has a right to their privacy, but I hope in time you might trust me enough to let me in." Greta's throat tightened. "Jackson, you don't know me. If you did, you might not feel the same way." He reached out and took her hand, his touch gentle but firm. "People aren't defined by their past, Greta. They're defined by who they choose to be now, and the woman I see is someone worth knowing." She wanted to believe him so badly it hurt. But the scar beneath her collar seemed to burn, reminding her of all the reasons men had looked away from her, all the whispered comments about how tragic it was that such a pretty girl was now ruined. "I should go in," she whispered. Jackson nodded and helped her down, his hands steady on her waist. "Thank you for coming today. It meant a lot to all of us." That night, alone in her room, Greta stood before the mirror and unbuttoned her collar. The scar looked particularly angry in the lamplight, a thick, ropey ridge of damaged tissue. She traced it with her finger, remembering the pain of the burns, the months of healing, the looks of horror when the bandages first came off. How could someone like Jackson Ellis ever accept this? He was strong and handsome and whole. She was broken, marked, damaged beyond repair. It was better to keep her distance to protect both of them from inevitable disappointment. But as she lay in bed that night, she couldn't stop thinking about his storm-colored eyes and the warmth in his voice when he said her name. The weeks passed, and fall began to creep into the New Mexico territory. The mornings were cooler, and the leaves on the cottonwoods along the river started to turn gold. Greta fell deeper into the rhythm of teaching, finding joy in her students' progress and pride in their achievements. Jackson came to town every Saturday for supplies, and he always stopped by the schoolhouse to check on Emma and Daniel's progress. These visits became the highlight of Greta's week. They would talk about the children, about the ranch, about books they'd read and places they'd seen. Jackson had traveled more than Greta expected, having driven cattle to Kansas several times and visited Denver and Santa Fe. He never pushed her for more than she was willing to give, never asked about her past, or why she'd come to Fort Stanton. But his interest was clear in the way he looked at her, in the small gestures of care he showed. He brought her fresh vegetables from Sarah's garden, fixed a loose board on the schoolhouse steps without being asked, and once brought her a book of poetry he thought she might enjoy. Greta found herself looking forward to these visits, found herself thinking about Jackson far more than was proper. She tried to maintain distance, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. He was everything she had never expected to find: kind, strong, thoughtful, and genuinely interested in her thoughts and opinions. One Saturday in late September, Jackson arrived at the schoolhouse with a troubled expression. "Greta, I need to ask a favor. Sarah's come down with a bad cold and I need someone to watch Emma and Daniel tomorrow while I handle some ranch business. I know it's your day off, but I'm rather desperate." "Of course," Greta said without hesitation. "I'd be happy to help." Relief flooded his face. "Thank you. I'll come get you in the morning." The next day dawned clear and cool. Jackson arrived at the boarding house just after breakfast, and they drove out to the ranch in comfortable silence. Sarah was indeed sick, her voice hoarse and her face flushed with fever. The doctor had already been out and prescribed rest and fluids. "I feel terrible leaving you with this," Sarah croaked from her bed. "The kids will run wild." "Nonsense," Greta said, surprising herself with her confidence. "We'll be fine. You just rest and get better." Jackson left to meet with a potential buyer for some of his cattle, promising to be back by evening. Emma and Daniel stood in the doorway of Sarah's room, looking worried about their sister. "Come on," Greta said gently. "Let's let Sarah sleep. I think we should make cookies for her when she wakes up." The children brightened immediately, and soon the kitchen was filled with flour dust and laughter. Greta taught them how to make sugar cookies, showing Emma how to measure ingredients properly and helping Daniel cut out shapes with tin cups and a whiskey glass. They made a mess, but it was a joyful mess. After the cookies were baking, they took some out to the ranch hands having lunch in the bunkhouse. Tom and Pete were grateful and friendly, teasing Emma and Daniel gently. Greta felt a warm sense of belonging she hadn't experienced in years. In the afternoon, she helped Emma with her reading while Daniel worked on his arithmetic. Then they all went outside to feed the chickens and gather eggs. Greta learned how to tell if an egg was fresh and which hens were the best layers. Emma showed her the vegetable garden Sarah tended, still producing squash and late tomatoes despite the cooling weather. As the sun began to set, they checked on Sarah, who was sleeping peacefully. Greta started dinner, finding her way around the kitchen with Emma's help. They made stew from leftover beef, along with fresh biscuits. By the time Jackson returned, dusty and tired, the house smelled wonderful and the table was set. "You're a miracle worker," he said, taking in the clean kitchen, the happy children, and the hot meal waiting. "I can't thank you enough." "It was my pleasure," Greta said, and meant it. The day had been tiring but fulfilling. She had felt useful, needed, part of something larger than herself. After dinner, Emma and Daniel went to do their evening chores. Jackson walked Greta out to the porch, where the last rays of sunlight painted the mountains purple and pink. "Greta, I need to tell you something," he said, his voice serious. He turned to face her, his eyes intense in the fading light. "I've been trying to take things slow, to be respectful of whatever boundaries you need. But I can't keep pretending I don't feel what I feel. I care about you, more than I've cared about anyone in a long time. I think about you constantly. I find excuses to come to town just to see you. And days like today, seeing you with my family in my home, it just makes me more certain." Greta's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. "Jackson, you don't understand. I'm not who you think I am. I'm not whole. I'm damaged." "We're all damaged," he said softly, taking her hand. "Life damages us. Loss damages us. But that doesn't make us unworthy of love." She pulled her hand away, stepping back. The walls she'd built so carefully were crumbling, and she was terrified. "You don't know what you're saying. If you really knew me, if you saw all of me, you'd feel differently." "Then show me," he challenged gently. "Whatever you're hiding, whatever you think will change my mind, show me, because I don't believe anything could." Greta's hands went to her collar, trembling. For 5 years, she had hidden her scar from the world, revealed it only to doctors and in the privacy of her own room. The thought of showing Jackson, of seeing his expression change from warmth to disgust, was terrifying. But something in his eyes, some quality of absolute certainty, made her believe that maybe, just maybe, he meant what he said. With shaking fingers, she began to unbutton her collar. Jackson stood perfectly still, his expression patient and open. She undid the first button, then the second, then the third. The cool evening air touched her neck, and she felt more exposed than she had ever felt in her life. She pulled the collar away, revealing the scar in all its ugliness. It was thick and ropey, starting below her left ear and running down her neck in an irregular pattern, before disappearing beneath her chemise. In the fading light, It looked even worse than usual, the tissue puckered and discolored. Jackson's eyes moved to the scar and Greta held her breath, waiting for the inevitable recoil, the look of horror or pity that always came. But it never did. Instead, Jackson reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. When she didn't move, he gently traced the scar with his fingertips, his touch feather-light and unbearably tender. "How did this happen?" he asked quietly. "A fire," Greta whispered, her voice breaking. "5 years ago. It killed my parents. I tried to save them, went back into the burning house. I got my mother out, but she died of smoke inhalation before the doctor arrived. My father never made it out at all, and I was left with this reminder of my failure." Jackson's hand moved from her scar to cup her face, his thumb brushing away tears she hadn't realized she was crying. "You're not a failure, Greta. You're one of the bravest people I've ever met. You ran into a burning building to save the people you loved. That's not failure, that's heroism. But they died anyway," she sobbed, "and I'm left with this ugly mark." Jackson leaned forward slowly, his eyes holding hers. Then he pressed his lips gently to her scar, kissing the damaged skin with infinite tenderness. "Not ugly," he whispered against her neck. "Beautiful. You're beautiful, Greta. Every part of you, including this. This scar is proof that you loved so deeply you were willing to risk everything. How could that ever be ugly?" He straightened and looked into her eyes, his hand still cupping her face. "You're perfect, Greta Zimmer. Exactly as you are, and I'm falling in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, impossible and wonderful. Greta stared at him, searching his face for any sign of deception or pity. But all she saw was honesty and warmth and something that looked very much like love. "How can you say that?" she whispered. "You barely know me." "I know enough," he said firmly. "I know you're kind to children and patient with their questions. I know you're intelligent and well-read. I know you have a quiet strength that's more impressive than any loud bravado. I know my siblings adore you, and Sarah's been hinting for weeks that I should court you properly. I know that when you smile, which isn't often enough, it lights up everything around you. And I know that when I think about my future, you're in it." Greta felt something inside her break open, some carefully guarded place she'd locked away after the fire. Tears streamed down her face, but they weren't tears of sadness anymore. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I'm scared of believing this is real and then losing it." Jackson pulled her gently into his arms and she went willingly, resting her head against his broad chest. She could hear his heart beating, strong and steady. "Life doesn't come with guarantees," he said softly, his chin resting on top of her head. "I lost my parents. You lost yours. We both know how quickly everything can change. But that's exactly why we shouldn't waste time being afraid. We should grab happiness when we find it and hold on tight." They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms as the stars began to appear overhead. Greta felt safe in a way she hadn't in years, protected and accepted exactly as she was. Finally, Jackson pulled back slightly to look at her face. "I should take you back to town. It's getting late and people will talk if I keep you out here all night." Greta nodded, though she was reluctant to leave the warmth of his embrace. As they drove back to Fort Stanton, she sat closer to him than propriety dictated, and his arm stayed around her shoulders the entire way. At the boarding house, he helped her down and walked her to the door. "May I call on you properly?" he asked, his voice formal but his eyes twinkling. "I'd like to court you, Greta, the right way, the traditional way." "Yes," she said, smiling up at him. "I'd like that very much." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, his eyes never leaving hers. "Good night, Greta. I'll see you Saturday." She floated up to her room, feeling lighter than she had in years. That night she stood before her mirror and looked at her scar with new eyes. It was still there, still ugly by conventional standards. But Jackson had kissed it and called her perfect, and somehow that changed everything. The next few weeks were the happiest of Greta's life. Jackson came to town every Saturday and Wednesday, and they spent as much time together as propriety allowed. He took her on walks along the river, brought her wildflowers, and sat with her on the church steps talking about everything and nothing. The town noticed, of course. Martha Sullivan beamed whenever she saw them together, clearly pleased with her matchmaking success, even though she hadn't actually done anything. Other townswomen offered knowing smiles, and Mrs. Crawford at the boarding house became decidedly more cheerful. Greta visited the ranch several times, always officially to check on Emma and Daniel's progress, but really to spend time with Jackson and his family. Sarah recovered from her cold and became one of Greta's closest friends, often inviting her to stay for dinner, and not so subtly leaving her alone with Jackson. In mid-October, Jackson took Greta on a picnic to a beautiful spot in the foothills. They spread a blanket under a massive cottonwood tree, its leaves golden in the autumn sun, and ate the lunch Sarah had packed for them. "I have something to ask you," Jackson said after they'd finished eating. He looked nervous, his hands fidgeting with his hat. Greta's heart began to race. "What is it?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "I know we haven't been courting long by most standards, but I'm 30 years old, Greta, and I've dated enough to know when something is right. You're right. You're right for me, for my family, for the life I want to build. I can't imagine my future without you in it." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond. It wasn't large or ostentatious, but it was beautiful. "Greta Zimmer, will you marry me? Will you be my wife and partner, help me raise my siblings, build a life on the ranch? I promise to love you and cherish you every day, to never make you feel less than perfect, to give you reasons to smile and laugh." Greta's hands flew to her mouth as tears spilled down her cheeks. "Yes," she gasped. "Yes, Jackson, I'll marry you." He slid the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly. Then he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her for the first time, gentle and sweet and full of promise. Greta's whole body came alive, every nerve ending singing with joy. This was what happiness felt like, what love felt like, and it was better than anything she'd ever imagined. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Jackson rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Greta. I'll spend every day showing you how much." "I love you too," she whispered, the words feeling natural and right. "I never thought I'd feel this way about anyone, never thought anyone could see past my scars and love me. But you do, and that's the most precious gift I've ever received." They spent the rest of the afternoon talking about their future, making plans. They would marry before Christmas, a small ceremony at the church. Greta would continue teaching until the end of the school year, then take on the role of running the ranch household alongside Sarah. Eventually, Sarah would likely marry and have her own home, but there was no rush. They were family, and family took care of each other. The announcement of their engagement was met with enthusiasm by nearly everyone in Fort Stanton. The townspeople had grown fond of their quiet schoolteacher and approved of her match with Jackson Ellis, one of the most respected ranchers in the area. The weeks leading up to the wedding flew by in a blur of preparation. Sarah and several other women helped Greta sew her wedding dress, a simple but elegant creation in cream-colored silk with lace at the sleeves and neckline. Greta designed it herself, ensuring it covered her scar while still being beautiful. But as she tried it on for the final fitting, Jackson's words came back to her. "You're perfect, exactly as you are." On impulse, she asked Sarah to alter the neckline, making it lower, more open. Sarah's eyes widened, but she didn't ask questions, just nodded and began making the changes. The night before the wedding, Greta stood in her room at the boarding house, looking at the final dress. The neckline now showed the top of her scar, no longer hiding it completely. She had spent 5 years concealing it, 5 years ashamed and frightened. But Jackson had kissed it and called her perfect, and she was done hiding. The wedding day dawned cold and clear, the first snow of winter dusting the mountains. Greta dressed carefully with Martha's help, her hands surprisingly steady. The dress fit perfectly, and when she looked in the mirror, she saw not a damaged woman hiding behind high collars but a bride, beautiful and loved. The church was packed with townspeople, all there to witness the union. Emma and Daniel sat in the front row, beaming with excitement. Sarah stood beside Greta as her maid of honor, lovely in a blue dress that matched her eyes. Then the music began, and Greta walked down the aisle toward Jackson. He stood at the altar in a new suit, his dark hair neatly combed, his eyes locked on her face. As she drew closer, she saw the moment he noticed the new neckline, saw his eyes drop to the visible scar. His expression didn't change to shock or disappointment. Instead, his smile grew wider, and his eyes shone with unshed tears. When she reached him, he took both her hands in his. "You're breathtaking," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Reverend Thompson performed the ceremony, speaking about love and partnership and the sacred bond of marriage. But Greta barely heard the words. She was lost in Jackson's eyes, in the promise she saw there of a future filled with love and acceptance. When it came time to say their vows, Jackson's voice was strong and clear. "I, Jackson Ellis, take you, Greta Zimmer, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love you in all circumstances, to support your dreams, to cherish every part of you, the visible and the hidden. I promise to be your partner, your protector, your friend and your love from this day forward for all the days of my life." Greta's voice trembled but didn't break. "I, Greta Zimmer, take you, Jackson Ellis, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to love you faithfully, to stand beside you in times of joy and hardship, to be a good partner and helpmate. I promise to open my heart fully to you, to trust in your love, and to build a life with you filled with happiness and purpose, from this day forward, for all the days of my life." Reverend Thompson smiled. "By the power vested in me by the territory of New Mexico and Almighty God, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Jackson, you may kiss your bride." Jackson stepped closer, his hands gentle as they framed her face. He kissed her softly at first, then deeper, and the church erupted in applause and cheers. When they finally broke apart, both grinning, Reverend Thompson presented them to the congregation. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I present Mr. and Mrs. Jackson Ellis." The reception was held at the church hall, with tables groaning under the weight of food brought by generous townspeople. There was music and dancing, laughter and celebration. Jackson never left Greta's side, his hand always at her waist or holding hers, as if he couldn't bear to be separated from her even for a moment. When they finally left the reception late that evening, heading back to the ranch in Jackson's wagon, Greta felt like she was floating. She was married. She had a husband who loved her, a family who accepted her, and a future that looked brighter than anything she'd ever dared to dream. At the ranch house, Sarah had decorated their bedroom with candles and flowers. She, Emma, and Daniel were staying in the bunkhouse for the night, giving the newlyweds privacy. Jackson carried Greta over the threshold, both of them laughing. He set her down gently in their bedroom and closed the door. "Mrs. Ellis," he said, his voice full of wonder. "My wife." "Mr. Ellis," she responded, smiling up at him. "My husband." He reached out and gently traced her scar, the gesture now familiar and beloved. I meant what I said in my vows. I cherish every part of you. This scar, everything it represents, your courage, your love, your survival, it's all part of the woman I fell in love with. Greta felt tears prick her eyes, but they were happy tears. You've given me my life back, Jackson. I was just existing before, going through the motions. But you've made me feel alive again, made me believe I'm worthy of love and happiness. You are, he said firmly. You always were. I'm just glad I get to be the one to remind you every day. They came together then, no longer patient or tentative, but full of passion and love. As Jackson gently helped her out of her wedding dress, his hands reverent on her skin, Greta felt beautiful for the first time since the fire. In his eyes, she saw desire and love, not pity or disgust. He kissed her scar, then her lips, then every inch of skin he uncovered, worshiping her with his touch and his words. Their wedding night was everything Greta had hoped it would be and more. Jackson was gentle but passionate, considerate but ardent. He made her feel cherished and desired, beautiful and whole. And when they finally fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, Greta knew she had found her home. The next morning, she woke to find Jackson already up, bringing her breakfast in bed. I thought you might be hungry, he said, setting the tray down carefully. Greta sat up, pulling the sheet around her. You cooked. Don't sound so surprised. I'm not helpless in the kitchen, he grinned. Although I'll admit this is Sarah's handiwork. She and the kids came back early and insisted on making us breakfast. They ate together in comfortable intimacy, talking about nothing important. Then Jackson set the tray aside and pulled her close. Ready to start our life together? He asked. I've been ready since you kissed my scar and called me perfect, she said, smiling up at him. The first months of marriage were an adjustment. Greta had to learn the rhythms of ranch life, the constant demands of animals and land. She still taught school during the week, returning home each evening to help Sarah with dinner and household chores. It was exhausting but fulfilling. Jackson was an attentive husband, always making time for her despite the demands of the ranch. He would steal kisses in the barn, bring her coffee while she graded papers, and sit with her on the porch in the evenings talking about their days. At night, they explored their physical relationship, learning each other's bodies and preferences with joy and laughter. Sarah became not just a sister-in-law but a true friend. The two women worked together seamlessly, managing the household with efficiency and grace. Emma and Daniel thrived under Greta's guidance, both at school and at home. The family that had been fractured by loss slowly healed, becoming stronger and more complete. Winter passed into spring, and Greta finished her first year of teaching. The school board asked her to return the following year, but she and Jackson had talked about it extensively. She wanted to focus on the ranch and, hopefully, starting a family of their own. In late May, Greta realized she had missed her monthly courses. She waited another week, afraid to hope, before mentioning it to Sarah. Sarah's face lit up with joy. Oh, Greta, have you told Jackson? Not yet. I wanted to be sure first. Do you think I should see the doctor? Absolutely. But I think we both know what he's going to say. Dr. Patterson confirmed what Greta already suspected. She was about 2 months along, due in early December. Greta left his office in a daze, one hand pressed to her still flat stomach. That evening she waited until after dinner, when Emma and Daniel had gone to do their homework, and Sarah was in the kitchen. Jackson was in his study, going over ranch accounts. Greta stood in the doorway, suddenly nervous. Jackson, can I talk to you? He looked up immediately, his expression concerned. Of course. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. She stepped into the room and closed the door. I saw the doctor today. Jackson was on his feet instantly, worry flooding his face. Are you ill? Is something wrong? No, nothing like that. She took his hands, unable to keep the smile from her face. "Jackson, I'm expecting. We're going to have a baby." For a moment he just stared at her, processing the words. Then his face broke into the biggest smile she'd ever seen. He let out a whoop of joy, picked her up, and spun her around. "We're having a baby," he exclaimed. "Greta, we're having a baby." Sarah burst through the door, followed by Emma and Daniel. "What's all the shouting about?" Jackson set Greta down gently, his arm around her waist. "Greta's expecting. You're all going to be an aunt and uncle." The room erupted in celebration. Sarah hugged Greta tightly, tears in her eyes. "I'm so happy for you both." Emma and Daniel were full of questions. Would it be a boy or a girl? When would it arrive? Could they help take care of it? That night, as Greta and Jackson lay in bed, his hand resting gently on her stomach, they talked about their hopes and dreams for their child. "Boy or girl?" Jackson asked. "I don't care as long as the baby is healthy." Though a boy would be nice to carry on the Ellis name. Jackson kissed her temple. "A daughter would be wonderful too, smart and strong like her mother." "I'm scared," Greta admitted quietly. "What if something goes wrong? What if I'm not a good mother?" "You'll be an amazing mother," Jackson said firmly. "Look at how good you are with Emma and Daniel, with all your students, and nothing will go wrong. I'll make sure you have the best care, that you rest when you need to, that you're never alone or afraid." He was true to his word. As Greta's pregnancy progressed, Jackson was attentive to the point of being overprotective. He insisted she stop riding horses, limited her heavy lifting, and made sure she ate regular, nutritious meals. Sarah fussed over her too, making special foods to combat morning sickness and sewing baby clothes in every spare moment. Summer turned to fall, and Greta's body changed and grew. She marveled at the life growing inside her, felt the first flutters of movement that gradually became stronger kicks. Jackson loved to put his hand on her swollen belly and feel the baby move, his face filled with wonder. In early December, just after the first major snowfall, Greta went into labor. It started in the early morning, mild contractions that gradually grew stronger. Sarah sent Daniel to fetch the doctor and Emma to tell Jackson, who was out checking on the cattle. The labor was long and difficult. Dr. Patterson arrived and set up in Greta and Jackson's bedroom. Sarah stayed by Greta's side, holding her hand and wiping her forehead with cool cloths. Jackson paced outside the door, refusing to leave despite Sarah's suggestions that he go tend to ranch business. Hours passed. The pain was intense, worse than anything Greta had experienced, even worse than the burns from the fire. But Sarah's steady presence and the knowledge that Jackson was just outside the door gave her strength. Finally, as the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered mountains pink and gold, the baby arrived. The first cry filled the room, strong and healthy, and Greta collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted and relieved. "It's a boy," Dr. Patterson announced, cleaning the baby and wrapping him in a blanket Sarah had made. "A healthy, strong boy." He placed the baby in Greta's arms, and she looked down at her son for the first time. He had a shock of dark hair, bright blue eyes that would probably change color, and tiny, perfect features. Love flooded through her so intensely, it was almost painful. The door burst open and Jackson rushed in, still in his work clothes. He stopped short when he saw Greta holding the baby, his eyes filling with tears. "A son," Greta said softly. "We have a son." Jackson crossed the room in 3 strides and sat carefully on the edge of the bed. He looked down at his son with an expression of absolute awe. "He's perfect. You're both perfect." "What should we name him?" Greta asked. They had discussed names but never decided definitively. Jackson reached out and gently stroked the baby's cheek with one finger. "What about Matthew?" "After your father." Greta's eyes filled with tears. Her father's name had been Matthew, and that Jackson would suggest honoring him meant everything. "Matthew Jackson Ellis," she said. "It's perfect." The next few weeks were a blur of sleepless nights and constant feedings. Matthew was a good baby for the most part, but he still needed care around the clock. Jackson helped whenever he could, walking the floor with his son in the middle of the night, changing diapers and rocking him to sleep. Sarah was invaluable, taking over household duties so Greta could focus on Matthew. Emma and Daniel were enchanted with their nephew, constantly wanting to hold him and help care for him. The ranch house was filled with life and laughter and love. One night in late December, after Matthew had finally fallen asleep, Greta and Jackson sat together on the couch in front of the fire. She leaned against his shoulder, exhausted but content. "You ever think about where you'd be if you hadn't come to Fort Stanton?" Jackson asked quietly. Greta considered the question. Probably still in Pennsylvania, teaching at some school, living alone in a boarding house, hiding behind my collars, existing but not really living. "I think about it sometimes," Jackson admitted, "about how close I came to never meeting you. If the previous teacher hadn't left, if you hadn't answered the advertisement, if you'd chosen a different town, so many things had to line up perfectly. I used to think the fire was the worst thing that ever happened to me," Greta said softly. "It took my parents, left me scarred and alone. But maybe it was also what brought me here to you. I'd never wish for it to happen again, but I can see now that something good came from all that tragedy." Jackson kissed the top of her head. "I love you, Greta Ellis. Thank you for taking a chance on me, on us, on this life. I love you too. More than I ever thought possible." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire and listening to Matthew's soft breathing from his cradle nearby. Outside, snow was falling again, covering the ranch in a fresh blanket of white. But inside, everything was warm and safe and full of love. The years passed quickly, filled with joy and challenges. Matthew grew into a healthy, active boy with his father's eyes and his mother's inquisitive nature. When he was 2, Greta gave birth to a daughter they named Ruth, after Jackson's mother. She had auburn hair like Emma, and a sunny disposition that charmed everyone she met. Sarah eventually married a young rancher named Thomas Wright, who had a spread about 5 miles from the Ellis Ranch. She and Thomas built a life together but remained close to the family, visiting often. Emma grew into a lovely young woman, eventually becoming a teacher herself at the Fort Stanton school. Daniel, at 16, was already showing signs of becoming an excellent rancher, learning everything he could from Jackson. The ranch prospered under Jackson's management. He expanded their cattle operation and began breeding horses, building a reputation for quality stock throughout the territory. Greta managed the household and helped with the ranch books, her education proving invaluable in keeping track of finances and contracts. She never wore high collars anymore. The scar was visible in every dress she owned, a part of her she no longer felt the need to hide. The people of Fort Stanton grew so accustomed to it that they stopped noticing, seeing instead the capable, kind woman who had become a pillar of their community. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Jackson took Greta back to the spot where he had proposed, spreading a blanket under the same cottonwood tree. The children were home with Sarah, giving them a rare day alone together. "You remember what I said when I proposed?" Jackson asked, pulling her close. "You said you couldn't imagine your future without me in it," Greta recalled, smiling at the memory. "I still can't. These 5 years have been the best of my life. You've given me love, children, a home that's more than just a house. You've made me happier than I ever thought possible." "You've done the same for me," Greta said, reaching up to touch his face. "You saw past my scars and loved me anyway. You gave me the courage to stop hiding and start living. You gave me a family and a purpose. Everything good in my life started the day you walked into that schoolhouse." Jackson kissed her, long and deep, and Greta felt the same spark she'd felt on their wedding night. After 5 years and 2 children, she still desired her husband, still felt her heart race when he touched her. "I have something for you," Jackson said, pulling back. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. Greta opened it to find a delicate gold locket. Inside was a tiny photograph of Matthew and Ruth, their faces serious in the formal portrait style. "It's beautiful," she breathed. Jackson fastened it around her neck. "I wanted you to have something that showed what we've built together, our family, our love, our life." "I don't need a locket to remind me," Greta said, but she touched it gently, moved by the gesture. "But I'll treasure it always." They spent the rest of the afternoon talking and laughing, remembering their early days together and making plans for the future. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Jackson pulled her to her feet. "Dance with me," he said. "There's no music." "We don't need music." He pulled her into his arms and they swayed together, moving to a rhythm only they could hear. Greta rested her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat, and felt completely at peace. This was happiness, she thought. Not the absence of scars or pain, but the presence of love and acceptance. Not perfection, but wholeness. When Matthew was 5 and Ruth was 3, Greta discovered she was expecting again. This pregnancy was harder than the previous 2, with more sickness and exhaustion. But Jackson and the children rallied around her, taking over her duties and making sure she rested. In late spring of 1884, she gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl they named James and Grace. The birth was difficult, and Dr. Patterson told her gently that she probably shouldn't have more children. Greta mourned briefly for the large family she'd envisioned, but 4 healthy children was more than she'd ever dared to hope for. The ranch house, which had once seemed so spacious, now felt comfortably full. Children's voices echoed through the rooms, toys littered the floors, and laughter filled every corner. Jackson built an addition, adding 2 more bedrooms and expanding the kitchen. Daniel, now 18, took on more responsibilities at the ranch, allowing Jackson to spend more time with his growing family. Emma, at 21, was courting a young lawyer from Albuquerque. The family that had been broken by tragedy had not only healed but grown stronger and larger. One evening, when the twins were about 6 months old, Greta sat on the porch with Sarah, who had come for dinner. They watched Jackson playing with the children in the yard, his laughter mingling with theirs. "You did good, Greta," Sarah said softly. "You brought life back to this house, to all of us. After my mother died, I didn't think we'd ever be truly happy again, but you proved me wrong." "I didn't do it alone," Greta said. "You all welcomed me, accepted me, loved me. I was the one who got the blessing." "It was mutual," Sarah insisted. "And my brother is a different man since he met you. He was so serious before, carrying the weight of the ranch and our family on his shoulders alone. You lightened that load, gave him reasons to smile again." Greta watched Jackson swing Matthew around while Ruth danced nearby, holding the hand of baby Grace. Her heart swelled with love for all of them. "I never thought I'd have this," she admitted quietly. "After the fire, after seeing how people looked at me, I thought I'd spend my life alone. I'd made peace with it, or thought I had, but Jackson showed me I deserved more, that I was worth loving despite my scars." Sarah squeezed her hand. "Because of your scars, not despite them. They're part of your story, part of what made you strong enough to take a chance on a widowed rancher and his siblings in the middle of nowhere." That night, after the children were finally in bed and the house was quiet, Greta and Jackson sat together in their room. She was nursing Grace while he held James, who had fallen asleep against his father's chest. 4 children, Jackson marveled. Sometimes I can't believe how blessed we are. I know, Greta said, smiling down at Grace's tiny face. I keep waiting to wake up and find it was all a dream. It's real, Jackson assured her. All of this is real, our love, our family, our life together, and it's going to keep getting better. He was right. As the years passed, their love deepened and matured. They had their challenges, of course. Droughts threatened the ranch. Illness came to the children. Money was sometimes tight. But they faced everything together, their partnership stronger than any obstacle. Matthew grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved books as much as ranching. Ruth was social and outgoing, making friends wherever she went. James was adventurous and fearless, keeping everyone on their toes. Grace was quiet and observant, taking everything in with her wise gray eyes. Daniel eventually married a girl from town and built a house on the Ellis property, working the ranch alongside Jackson. Emma married her lawyer and moved to Albuquerque, though she visited often with her own growing family. On their 10th anniversary, Jackson took Greta to Santa Fe for a week, leaving the children with Sarah and Daniel. It was the first time they'd been alone together for more than a day since Matthew was born. They stayed in a nice hotel, ate at restaurants, and explored the city like tourists. But Greta's favorite moments were the quiet ones in their room, when Jackson would hold her close and they would talk for hours about everything and nothing. "Any regrets?" he asked one night as they lay in bed, her head on his chest. "Not a single one," she said honestly. "Sometimes I think about how different my life might have been if the fire had never happened. I might have married someone in Pennsylvania, lived a comfortable but unremarkable life. But I don't think I would have been as happy as I am now." "The fire brought you to me," Jackson said, his hand tracing lazy patterns on her back. "I hate that you had to go through that pain, that you lost your parents, but I'm grateful every day that you ended up in Fort Stanton." "So am I." When they returned home, the children rushed to greet them, talking over each other about everything that had happened while they were gone. Matthew had learned to rope a calf, Ruth had baked her first cake, James had fallen out of a tree but was fine, and Grace had spoken her first full sentence. That night, tucked into their own bed with their children safely asleep down the hall, Greta felt a profound sense of gratitude. Her life hadn't turned out the way she'd planned, but it had turned out better than she'd ever dreamed. The years continued to pass, bringing changes and growth. New Mexico became a state in 1912, and Fort Stanton grew from a small frontier town into a proper community. The Ellis Ranch prospered, becoming one of the most successful operations in the region. Matthew went to college in Denver to study law, following in his uncle's footsteps. Ruth married a local rancher and stayed close to home. James joined the Army, serving honorably before returning to help run the ranch. Grace became a teacher, like her mother, taking over the Fort Stanton school. Greta and Jackson grew older together, their hair turning gray, their movements slower, but their love never dimmed. Jackson still looked at Greta with the same intensity he had that first night at the social. Greta still felt her heart race when he touched her. On their 30th anniversary, surrounded by children and grandchildren, Jackson stood and raised his glass. 30 years ago, I married the most remarkable woman I'd ever met. She was hiding behind high collars and walls of fear, convinced she was damaged and unworthy of love. But I saw past the scars to the incredible person beneath, and she took a chance on me, on us, on building a life together. He turned to Greta, his eyes shining with tears. "You have given me everything, Greta. Love, family, purpose, joy. You made me a better man, a better father, a better human being. and I would marry you again tomorrow without a moment's hesitation. Greta stood, her own eyes wet. And I would say yes again, just as quickly. You saw me when I was invisible to everyone else, including myself. You loved me when I couldn't love myself. You gave me courage to stop hiding and start living. Everything good in my life exists because you walked into that schoolhouse 30 years ago and refused to give up on me. They kissed, to applause and cheers from their family. Their children and grandchildren surrounded them. Multiple generations of love and life that all started with a scarred schoolteacher and a compassionate cowboy. As the celebration continued around them, Greta touched the scar on her neck, now faded with age but still visible. She thought about that frightened young woman who had arrived in Fort Stanton so many years ago, desperate for a fresh start but terrified of rejection. If she could go back and tell that woman what the future held, would she even believe it? A loving husband, 4 wonderful children, grandchildren who brought endless joy, a full and meaningful life. All because one man had looked past her scars and seen her worth. "What are you thinking about?" Jackson asked, his arm around her waist. "How far we've come," she said. "How blessed we've been." "The blessing was mine," he said softly, kissing her temple. "You were always perfect, Greta. I just helped you see it." As the sun set over the ranch that evening, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold, Greta stood on the porch with Jackson, watching their family. Children played in the yard while adults talked and laughed. The house that had once felt too quiet was now filled with life and love. This was her legacy, she thought. Not the scar on her neck or the tragedy of her past, but this. A family built on love and acceptance, a home full of joy, a life lived fully and without fear. Jackson had been right that first night when he kissed her scar and called her perfect. She was perfect, not despite her flaws, but because of them, because they were part of her story, part of what made her who she was. And it was a story with the happiest of endings. Years later, when Greta and Jackson were in their 70s, they sat together on that same porch, watching the sun set over the mountains they'd looked at for so many years. Their bodies were old now, bent with age and hard work, but their hands were still intertwined, their love still strong. "Do you remember the day we met?" Greta asked, her voice soft with memory. "Every detail," Jackson said. "You were standing by the refreshment table, your hand at your collar, looking like you wanted to disappear. But even then, even when you were trying to be invisible, there was something about you that drew me in. I thought you were the most handsome man I'd ever seen," Greta admitted, "and I was terrified you'd notice me." Jackson laughed, the sound warm and familiar. "I couldn't help but notice you. You were all I saw." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned from blue to orange to purple. The ranch spread out before them, prosperous and well-maintained. Their children and grandchildren would carry it forward into the future, keeping the Ellis legacy alive. "Thank you," Greta said suddenly. "For what? For everything. For seeing past my scars, for loving me, for giving me this life, this family, for making me believe I was worthy of happiness." Jackson turned to her, his weathered face full of love. "You were always worthy, Greta. I just got lucky enough to be the one who convinced you." He leaned in and kissed her, gentle and sweet, the way he had kissed her scar that first night so many years ago. And Greta knew, deep in her bones, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The sun finally dipped below the mountains, leaving the sky painted in brilliant streaks of red and gold. Inside the house, they could hear their grandchildren's voices, full of energy and life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and joys, as every day did. But tonight they had each other, and that was more than enough. It always had been.